Welcome to the session, Low-Cost Annual Book Fairs Provide Access to Books and Mitigate Summer Reading Loss in High-Poverty Rural Tennessee Communities, the results of a longitudinal RCT study. My name is Tamika Brinson. I'll be your host and facilitator. I am the Florida Coordinator for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known as NAEP. In my role, I'm responsible for coordinating NAEP and international assessments for the state of Florida. I also serve as the liaison between NCES and my state education agency. I'm delighted to introduce and to present two distinguished and very capable speakers for our session today. Both have undertaken work in the field that is significant, impactful, and particularly relevant in reading education today. Anne McGill-Franzen is Professor Emerita at the University of Tennessee. The focus of her professional work has been on struggling readers. She directed a project to build teachers' expertise in early literacy and co-directed a federal longitudinal study to mediate the summer achievement gap in high-poverty minority schools. She recently replicated the summer book fair study in poor rural communities, and she has been the recipient of several IRA research awards in early literacy and reading disabilities. Natalia Ward is an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at East Tennessee State University. She focuses on preparing pre- and in-service teachers to work with multilingual students and effectively teach literacy. Previously, she taught English as a second language at the elementary school level in the United States. She holds a BA in Education and Linguistics, a master's in English as a second language education, and a PhD in literacy studies. We will now view the session presentation. I will rejoin you after the presentation for our Q&A session. Please be sure to enter your questions and comments in the chat space, and we'll address them to our presenters during the Q&A session. And now, Anne McGill-Franzen and Natalia Ward.
McGill-Franzen.
And I'm Natalia Ward.
Today, we are going to present our study on providing annual book fairs to mitigate summer reading loss among primary grade children in low-income rural East Tennessee schools. Almost 50 years ago, Haynes studied the spring to fall assessment of 5,000 Atlanta fifth graders and extrapolated the lost learning during summers, especially for poor children. Entwistle and Alexander studied the achievement of Baltimore children across several decades and coined the term faucet theory to explain summer slide. That is, that the spigot of resources is turned on when school is in session and off for low-income children during out-of-school time. Very recently, Atbury and McEachin examined the achievement of 18 million students between first and eighth grade on the NWEA Northwest Evaluation Association Developmental Scaled Assessment from 2008 to 2016 and found that summer learning differed dramatically among children, and this variability in summer learning profoundly contributed to what the authors call achievement inequality at the eighth grade. Over half of students experienced summer learning loss in all 5 intervening summers, meaning the same students lost ground summer after summer. Also, using large sample data from the NWEA assessment, researchers Kuffeld, Condren, and Downey in a recent seasonal learning study confirmed that learning gaps increased during summers among children attending low-income schools, and this pattern is as strong in grades 6 through 8 as in K through 2. This graph suggests that the 2013 NAEP data was dramatically influenced by children's access to books at home and the frequency of their summer reading. So the NAEP data indicated that only children who had over 100 books in the home and read for fun every day obtained a 4th grade reading score that averaged proficient, and that is in the upper right-hand corner. Anderson, Wilson, and Fielding's 1988 seminal study of how children spend their time outside of school provided compelling evidence that voluntary reading was not merely correlated with reading proficiency, but instead caused reading proficiency. The authors found that the amount of out-of-school reading predicted reading achievement between grades 2 through 5, but they also found great variability in the amount of voluntary book reading the children did, with some children reading every day and others doing no reading. Children with achievement at the 90th percentile read on average 14 minutes per day, but those at the 20th percentile read less than 1 minute. In a recent study published in Child Development and Reading Research Quarterly, Torpa and colleagues followed 2,500 Finnish children between 7 and 16 to further explore the relationship between reading books and development. They found that leisure reading and reading comprehension bear reciprocal relationships to each other, with the frequency of leisure book reading at 3rd grade predicting 9th grade reading comprehension on PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment. Given the strong association of voluntary reading with achievement that we've seen, and the corresponding research on summer reading loss, particularly in reading, we hypothesized that improving access to books for children from low-income families during the summer when schools are closed might support both voluntary reading and reading achievement. We briefly summarize here the original study and the replication study, which we recently finished. In the randomly controlled experimental study called the Annual Book Fair, we provided approximately 1,600 low-income students in grades 2 through 4 about 12 self-selected books for 3 consecutive summers. Students who received the books significantly outperformed the comparison students on the state Florida Comprehensive Assessment Test. The Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy determined that this study was near top tier because the treatment increased students' achievement by almost half a grade level after getting 3 summers of self-selected books to read. The study was also cost-effective, about $250 per student compared to almost $3,000 for summer school, and it greatly benefited the students. The coalition said that the study needed replication with another student population, a different state, and different state assessment.
So the recent replication study was funded by the NEE Casey Foundation and Laura and John Arnold Foundation, and involved high poverty population of rural students from East Tennessee. We evaluated the effectiveness of the replication on students' performance on the Tennessee Comprehensive Assessment Program in reading and on a self-reported survey of summer reading. The project began with sample selection in 2016, and the final state test was administered in 2019. The project involved 2 cohorts of students, totaling about 1,500 students at the outset, who received 10 to 14 self-selected books for summer reading for either 2 or 3 consecutive summers. Cohort 1 started as first graders in 2016 and received 3 summers of free self-selected books, whereas Cohort 2 students, also first graders, only in 2017, started the following year and only received free books for 2 summers. Cohort 1 took the 3rd grade TCAP in 2018 and the 4th grade TCAP in 2019. Cohort 2 took the 3rd grade TCAP in 2019. In addition, we collected district screener data every spring and administered literacy habits surveys every fall. Book fairs were set up in 43 schools in the spring before the summer vacation. Students were provided a corpus of about 400 to 500 books to look through and select to take home for the summer. Here you see the number of participants and our baseline and analytic sample for cohort 1, cohort 2, and pooled data set that represented grade 3 for both cohorts. Students in this particular study were 89% and 90% white for cohort 1 and cohort 2 respectively, with 72 and 77% of students receiving free or reduced price lunch for cohort 1 and cohort 2 respectively.
This slide represents cohort 1's third grade achievement on the TCAP, the Tennessee Comprehensive Assessment Program. They took this assessment in the spring of 2018 after 2 years of book fairs. As we noted earlier, our study used the TCAP to evaluate the efficacy of the intervention. And there were 3 parts to the TCAP that we were interested in as outcomes. One was the overall English Language Arts, or ELA, score. That overall ELA score, according to the Tennessee Department of Education, represented the ability to analyze informational and literary texts, provide text-dependent answers to comprehension questions, provide a written response to a prompt, and demonstrate control of vocabulary and language conventions. In addition, we were interested in 2 subtests on the TCAP. One, reading informational text, and the second, reading literature. The results from independent t-tests on cohort 1's third grade TCAP data demonstrated that we obtained comparable effect sizes as the original study, but after only 2 summers in the replication study. The treatment students performed significantly higher on overall ELA, as well as on the reading informational text subtest. Treatment students also had higher reading literature scores with probable type 2 errors. The free and reduced price lunch students in the treatment group scored significantly higher in reading informational text, actually almost a quarter of a standard deviation higher, and also in reading literature. The feathers on this graph represent the standard deviations. Cohort 1 also took the 4th grade TCAPs in the spring of 2019. At the 4th grade, after 3 summers of book fairs, there was a significant difference between the cohort 1 treatment groups in reading literature, and for the low-income treatment students, also very close to significance on the ELA overall score. We believe state policy curriculum changes influenced the direction of these results, but not necessarily in a bad way. The focus of primary grade reading shifted in Tennessee in 2019, in that the Tennessee Department of Education integrated reading and content units of study for these early grades, and approached the privileged informational texts in classroom instruction, and may have influenced the treatment effects on 4th grade TCAPs. That is, we obtained significance for reading literature, but we did not obtain significance for reading informational text. All students read more informational text in school, but only treatment students had annual book fair access to self-selected popular literature, such as Diary of a Wimpy Kid or Dork Diaries to read at home. We also examined cohort 2's 3rd grade TCAP scores taken also in spring 2019. But unlike the results for cohort 1, There were non-significant differences on all TCAP comparisons between treatment and control participants in cohort 2 at 3rd grade after 2 summers. The sample size was smaller, but probably good state policy influenced this outcome. The context of instruction changed dramatically for cohort 2 students. Tennessee initiated a literature and discussion-based summer program for early grade low-income children during the 2 years prior to and including the TCAP year 2019 that included a non-negotiable $200 per child award for self-selected summer books for home libraries. Children in 4 of our 7 districts participated. In addition, Save the Children Foundation partnered with our largest school district to support the same demographic as our study, that is, children eligible for free and reduced lunch in primarily 1st and 2nd grades. Save the Children provided in and outside of class tutoring, free books in summer and throughout the year, and up to an hour and a half of reading instruction and summer school. We also examined the pooled data from both cohort 1 and cohort 2 at the 3rd grade level using the ELA overall score and the reading literature and reading informational text subtest. Independent t-tests on this pooled data after both cohorts had experienced 2 years of book fairs indicated type 2 errors for all of our comparisons, with treatment participants scoring higher for each. Multiple regression analysis conducted on the pooled data determined the intervention contributed significant variance to the ELA overall score and the reading informational text outcomes. But for the reading literature outcome, type 2 error was detected as it related to the treatment. We thought that independent t-tests and multiple regression didn't give us information on whether and how the annual book fairs benefited students. We wanted to understand where along a distribution of students the annual book fair might be having the greatest and the least effect. For this, we conducted a quantile regression along the 20th, 40th, 60th, and 80th quantiles using the percentile achievement levels established by the state assessment. Our results indicated for cohort 1 at the 3rd grade level, no significant differences for treatment at the 20th quantile, but significant effects at the 40th, at the 60th, and almost significant effects at the 80th. When we added how often children reported they read during the summer to this model, there was still no treatment effect for children at the 20th percentile, but a significant effect of treatment for the 40th, 60th, and 80th quantile. Additionally, although we don't represent this in the table, there were significant subtest differences for treatment on the informational text at the 40th, 60th, and 80th quantile, and at the 40th and 60th for reading literature. The lack of treatment effects at the 20th quantile confirms that children learning to read need more than free self-selected books to make summer gains. We also conducted a quantile regression on cohort 1's 4th grade TCAP data. Again, no treatment effect at the 20th quantile and significant effect at the 40th, and when we add frequency of reading during the summer at the 60th as well. Additionally, there were significant subtest differences for treatment at the 60th for informational text and significant differences for treatment at the 40th, 60th, and 80th quantiles for reading literature. We conducted quantile regression on our pooled data that looked simply at the overall English language arts score. For the pooled cohort 1 and cohort 2 third grade TCAP overall achievement, there were no significant differences between treatment groups at either the 20th or the 40th quantiles, but significant effects at the 60th, and at the 80th quantiles.
We also looked at the self-reported survey results from the literacy habit surveys that we administered every fall to all participating children. We particularly were interested in whether students had access to books they could read at home and the frequency of their summer reading. The survey results mirror those of the achievement data, indicating there's a significant difference between treatment and cohort control for cohort 1 and for all years, and year 2 of cohort 2 on the frequency of the summer reading, with treatment children reading more over the summer months. In fact, pool data analysis of survey results demonstrated that the treatment participants were 2.59 times more likely to have books they can read at home, over 4 times more likely to have 10 or more books at home, were 3 times more likely to read every day or once or twice a week during the summer, and 2.5 times less likely to never read over the summer. So we wonder, why was our summer reading intervention successful? The annual book fairs, we think, provided children with the access to interesting texts that students themselves chose. Both of these elements have been found to contribute to motivation and achievement. Plus, as we discussed earlier, the recent Finnish study by Torpe demonstrated that leisure reading, that is reading for fun, by itself can improve reading comprehension on challenging international assessments. Also, despite a common belief that children's choices of books must be carefully curated, our analysis of children's choices revealed that they're quite capable of selecting books that align closely with their age, grade level, and developmental reading level. We also believed that the nature of the text that children selected provided practice and experience in navigating connected texts of various genres and building vocabulary and cultural knowledge. In both the original study and the replication conducted in Tennessee, students most often selected serious books, narrative, informational, and graphic, as you can see from this slide and the next. So the most popular books in the Tennessee study were books about Star Wars, Pokemon, and Minecraft, with trendy, serious books like Fly Guy, Diary Wimpy Kid, and Dogman also being in high demand by students.
So we believe that the nature of the books that children selected supported their achievement and their performance on the TCAP. In particular, we note the discourse redundancy of serious books. So, unlike classroom reading materials that typically control for word level and orthographic complexity, or build predictable syntactic patterns into the text, the discourse in serious books is the naturally occurring language of narration, dialogue, or exposition. What presents as redundancy are not words, but instead discourse elements. For example, the characters, the settings, the plots, and the organizational features. We present here as an example the Baby Mouse series. This is the first book in the series, entitled Baby Mouse, Queen of the World. The screenshots that follow are examples of the way Baby Mouse, which is a graphic novel series, scaffolds the comprehension of text. Baby Mouse, Queen of the World is an example of the multimodal genre that primary grade students select to read, like the popular Pokemon and Lego Ninjago, many Star Wars books, Dork Diaries, and Jeff Kinney's Diary of a Wimpy Kid. The Baby Mouse books are hybrid texts that use both prose and art in a comic book format. In this case, to represent the story of a hapless mouse trapped in the mundane who dreams of becoming a queen, rock star, hero, beach babe, and other glamorous roles. There are 19 books in this series, ranging from early to mid-second grade reading level, and each book provides not only the same characters, familiar home and school settings, and daydream sequences that give Baby Mouse the upper hand over mean girl cat Felicia Furry Paws. But it also presents literary elements and text features that are represented in each book. Such redundancy at the discourse level scaffolds the novice reader through approximately 100 pages of text. Okay, this screenshot is an example of an advanced organizer, and it's from book 1. A few panels at the beginning of each one of the Baby Mouse books sets the stage for the narration that follows and asks the reader to predict what will happen. In the first book, represented here, Baby Mouse, Queen of the World, the advanced organizer is titled Introducing Baby Mouse. It highlights her sassiness, her attitude, and her dreams. Each book in the series also has up front a character page. The narrator of the Baby Mouse series, whose voice always appears in a text box, tells the reader the name of each character. Extra information needed by the reader, in this case, the role of each character, is presented in text eras. The setting in each of these books makes note of how boring and mundane Baby Mouse's life was, but her dreams were not. To highlight this difference, Baby Mouse's dreams are represented by a pink background against the normal black and white illustrations. Intertextuality is a prominent feature of Baby Mouse and most graphic novels. Here, Baby Mouse is influenced by the noir detective text. This is a second example of a Baby Mouse book. It's called Baby Mouse Burns Rubber. In Baby Mouse Burns Rubber, the authors, brother and sister team, Jennifer and Matthew Holm, set Baby Mouse in another everyday, mundane context, school. And the authors explicitly reference the children's book, Goodnight Moon. In various daydreams by Baby Mouse in this text, Baby Mouse Burns Rubber, the authors also reference Roman chariot race motif. They explicitly allude to Around the World in 80 Days and Star Wars movies. At the end of each Baby Mouse book, there is a fan fiction bonus. Fan fiction is an example wherein readers inhabit the fictional worlds of other writers to create texts that extend or disrupt or develop aspects of the original, be it characters, plots, settings, and so on. An example of a famous fan fiction text is 50 Shades of Grey, which was a knockoff based on the Twilight series.
So, as you can see from the findings of this replication study, there are a lot of takeaways and potential implications for policy and learning. First and foremost, the annual book fair intervention was, as you saw, not effective for students who were at the 20th quintile or below in achievement on the state test. We can assume that these students were still mastering foundational skills and required instructional interventions in addition to self-selected books for out-of-school reading. The annual book fair, however, was an effective and low-cost intervention for students whose achievement fell in the middle or higher range of the distribution, those at the 40th through 80th quintiles.
Our analyses also seem to be sensitive to both state-initiated school year curriculum changes and changes in summer interventions. For example, the fact that cohort 2 treatment students scored marginally higher than controls, but no differences were significant on any of our TCAP outcomes we tested, may be related to the efficacy of the state summer school program that offered low-income students $200 for self-selected free books, an instructional program that focused on reading, writing, and discussion, and a Save the Children Foundation funding for tutoring, instruction, free book distribution in our largest participating district. Both the state policy and the Save the Children Foundation provided appropriate and needed literacy support, much beyond our $250 intervention. However, a cost-benefit analysis of the annual book fair demonstrates that a minimal financial investment in an unobtrusive intervention, similar in format to the middle-class scholastic book fairs, will reap dividends for young, low-income children in literacy engagement, improved achievement on state reading tests, and literary and cognitive development. Honestly, it's high time that low-income children do not walk away from a scholastic book fair with simply an eraser because they did not have the money to buy an exciting, trending, popular book that everyone wants to read and bring home.
Thank you so much for watching our presentation. We're looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you again to Anne and Natalia for the presentation and for joining us for the summit. We appreciate your time.
Muted.
The important work that you have undertaken in reading education. So I want to remind our participants to please enter your questions or comments for Anne and Natalia in our chat space on the right of your screen. And we'd like to start with a couple of questions for both of you. How can we translate some of the findings from your study into policy decisions that are related to both out of school and in school learning?
I'll take that up first. I think that we can see the results of kind of business as usual for summer school. If we look at the results of cohort 1 after 2 summers of book fairs, after only 2 summers of book fairs, the treatment kids dramatically outperformed the control students. And so this minimal financial intervention had such a strong impact on their reading comprehension on the state test that I think that we can't just continue with our business as usual, with some kind of summer school for some kids, and maybe community library programs. I mean, I think we need to take a concerted effort to make sure that all children have access to books. Natalia?
Just to build on that, I also think the finding indicating that free self-selected books were not quite sufficient for children who are still learning to read is a really powerful finding. So thinking about that and thinking about specific interventions and summer school activities that we engage these children in is really critical for policymakers. And also, just to build on that, with the new federal funding and lots of opportunities for school districts to invest into children's education, creating sort of a list of non negotiables, which providing self selected books can be one. In fact, we covered that in our presentation. The state of Tennessee, when they conducted the summer camps that were so widely successful, wrote that into the budget proposals that every child is to receive X number of dollars of home for the summer. So just decisions as simple as that, I think, can have a really powerful impact on the children's development.
I think other curriculum decisions that the states may make can also be highly influential. So in our fourth grade TCAP data, after 3 years of summer, we found that we think because the state emphasized informational text reading in their units of study, that we did not find significance in that part of the TCAP, but we did find significance in reading literature. So I think curriculum decisions, such as what to emphasize in their English language arts classes, can have broad ramifications for children's development in reading. The units of study, was another, what we think of as good policy. Maybe Natalia can talk about what that was, what the units of studies entailed.
Sure. So, the state of Tennessee at the time of study implementation, which is kind of interesting, right? Because it directly impacted the results that we were able to obtain, instituted what was called Read to Be Ready. And the curricular changes involved implementation of unit starters. So they were not completed units of study, they were meant to be something that teachers could use for read alouds in the classroom with suggestions for supplemental texts at students' reading level, for example. But the units of study were really an integrated approach to learning. So they were to be implemented during literacy instruction, but the content topics that were covered had to do with science, and the plan was to extend it to social studies. So, for example, one of the first grade unit starters had to do with identifying. It was earth science. So the children were to study planets and thinking about how objects in space move. So the essential questions that were addressed were pretty sophisticated. And so around that topic and essential question, there was a collection of texts, both fiction and nonfiction, that were used for shared read alouds. So I'm trying to think, what else do you think I should add, Anne? We thought those were pretty interesting. And for book fair implications, the children were familiar with some of these topics, which was interesting to see how it translated into the choices of the books for the summer. Because I think once they were familiar with some of these topics and potential questions to think about, they were more likely to select texts that informed their thinking if they were interested in this particular topic.
Great. It's really great information and I think very helpful. So we have another question for both of you. What can educational researchers do next to build on the findings of your study?
Well, I think one of the implications of the study and other studies that we cited in the review is that reading for pleasure is really important, and both for in-school and out-of-school literacy development. I think that has not been acknowledged as such, and that we haven't paid close attention to the idea of books themselves as scaffolds. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about decodable texts to provide that kind of redundancy at the orthographic or phonemic level, but not much discussion or acknowledgement of the importance of the construction of text itself. The redundancy that was apparent in series books among text elements and elements of text organization, how it made it explicit for a novice reader. I think that might be an area to look at more closely. Like, what is the contribution, not only of decodable texts to literacy development, but also series books that are, either graphic novels or fiction or informational text around a topic, that build understanding and comfort around that character, that setting, or that topic, and how that contributes to reading comprehension.
I can add to that. I think another area that is highly under-researched and I think should be closely examined given the recent events with pandemic and switch to online and digital learning, I think we know very little in terms of digital reading and how it impacts student reading achievement. The study that we talked about in our presentation by Turba and colleagues, their finding actually was that digital reading was negatively associated with reading skill development, but it's a really complicated topic, given that digital reading can mean basically anything from reading websites or participating in Facebook or reading ebooks. So looking at that more closely and really teasing it apart, especially when it comes to ebooks and audiobooks, that our consumption of those has exploded pretty drastically in the last year during pandemic. So it would be really fascinating to find out if children who have access to digital ebooks and audiobooks develop passion for literacy, love of learning to read, and how it impacts their reading achievement.
So I think that's exactly one of the themes that has come up time and again during the summit is the reading for pleasure, reading for enjoyment, and definitely some topics that would definitely be helped to be further researched. Any other suggestions or any other resources that you could direct our participants to before we conclude our session today?
Well, there has been a number of studies of free book distribution, even free book distribution to mitigate summer reading loss. But I think it's really important to consider a couple of things. One is the corpus of books that are available for children. They need to be books that are popular, that are that other peers are choosing. They need to be trending books, and we noticed in looking at the kinds of books that the children selected, that they weren't necessarily curriculum based. I mean, if they had been participants in a unit of study around a particular topic, they may have selected those books. But typically, they weren't curriculum based. As Natalia said in the presentation, it was Star Wars books, Pokemon, Dork Diaries, Diary, of a Wimpy Kid. Those were the popular books, and those were the ones that they wanted to read. And so the children were able to choose those books for themselves. So the corpus of books is important, and student choice is important. And some of the less successful or effective book distribution programs, I think, have used an algorithm that matches reading level to like an interest inventory. And that is not personalized enough to really motivate children, and certainly not personalized enough for kids who may have difficulty at the skills level, to motivate them to slog through that and read for pleasure.
Natalia, anything else to add before we conclude today?
I think I'll just say one more thing. I think that what Anne said is very powerful. I think there's a power in allowing children to have agency and voice in selection of texts that they choose for themselves. Sometimes as adults, we want to control what children choose, but I think there's really a power in supporting this sort of agentic participation, and giving children access to books that they actually want to read. But I think that as a group of researchers and educators, we have a lot of power in our hands to sort of allow children to do that. And as Anne said at the end of our PowerPoint, I think it's about time that every child in this country, and definitely in our state where the study was conducted, we're giving access to wonderful, cool, trendy books that they want to read.
Again, thank you so much to both of you, Anne McGill-Franzen and Natalia Ward, for your presentation and for your time during our summit today. We'd like to thank all of our participants for joining our session, and we'd like to encourage you to join us for the closing plenary session at the end of our time today, and that will conclude our session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.